Who is the They wanna know how to get like me. Dream so big that I cannot sleep. Put in that time and I put in that grind. I'm the best in the world, that's all I see. Never back down, I'm standing strong. They gonna talk, but they all been wrong. What they gonna say when I keep going up? What they gonna do when I don't fall off? Look at my skills, look at my flaws. Never been perfect, I'm not a god, but I'm a GOAT. I've been the greatest whenever I spoke. Looking around and they doing the most. Whatever I touch, I turn it to gold. Tell them there's levels to be in the game. They wanna compete, but they not coming close. No, I'ma keep going again and again. Whatever I want, I'ma get. They gon' be saying they know I'm a friend of a friend. Whenever I become the best, I don't be spending my time on the internet. I just be living it out in the flesh. I don't need nothing to motivate me. Winners are never gon' wait for success. Yeah. Look at my neck, shining. Look at my bank, comments. Look at my wrist, AP. Who is the GOAT? I am. Look at my neck, shining. Look at my bank, comments. Look at my wrist, AP. Who is the GOAT? I am. Hey, got more money and I got more problems. All that I want is peace and quiet. They all been bothering me, so I gotta keep my phone on silent. No matter the outcome, already know that I always keep on trying. They wanna do business, but I gotta be a partner, not no client. I'm not like the rest, too damn smart and they still wanna test me. Move to the MIA and I'm running my team like Messi. Everyone good all around me, I'm giving out bands like candy. Not Halloween, but they still be fake, no wonder they don't understand me. I still got a long way to go, all that I do is for me, not for show. I don't like putting no pressure on me, but lately I needed it all just to grow. I had to step out of my comfort zone, give it some time and leave it alone. Now that I'm back and I'm ready for more, I'll give them a reason to call me to go. Yeah. Look at my neck, shining. Look at my bank, comments. Look at my wrist, AP. Who is the GOAT? I am. Look at my neck, shining. Look at my bank, comments. Look at my wrist, AP. Who is the GOAT? I am.
Eu tirei essa porra da lama. Não tinha nada, agora eu tenho fama. Dinheiro tem pra família. Um troco pra minha filha não nascida. Congelei meu Rolex, me ilumina. Diamante eu pus no dedo da minha mina. Pra quem achou que era o brinca, foda-se tudo, quem manda é a 30. 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 Pra quem achou que era o brinca, foda-se tudo, quem manda é a 30. 30 no comando. Eu nem vou perder meu tempo pra criticar vocês. É que teu salário anual eu já fiz no primeiro mês. Liga pro Shaq que eu tô de rolê no 300C. Tô chegando com tô preto, tu vai fazendo acontecer, yeah. Em férias, casa na prainha, tô relaxando na piscina. Eu já bolei mais uma bomba, olha o meu extrato e 1 milhão na conta. Mas quem que acreditaria que eu ia dominar um dia? Eu tô vivendo meu sonho, vida boa, tendo tudo que eu queria. Essa porra da lama, não tinha nada, agora eu tenho fama. Dinheiro tem pra família. Um troco pra minha filha não nascida. Congelei meu Rolex, me ilumina. Diamante eu pus no dedo da minha mina. Pra quem achou que era o brinca, foda-se tudo, quem manda é a 30. 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 Pra quem achou que era o brinca, foda-se tudo, quem manda é a 30. Tá bom, por aqui tá tudo legal. Furtar e o clima tropical. Sazon, tô temperando o beat. Tu é Masterchef, cozinhando o hit. Avon, a tua beat eu sei que ela me quer, ela só não admite. Tô me empenhando pra portar os kits, pra manter esse meu cérebro de rachis. Essa semana me encontrei comprando um jeep. Só de mal vou recusar o fit. Quero um saco de dinheiro pra eu jogar no show, pode ser só nota de 20. Me diz tu é porque tu é assim, que porra é essa? Explica isso pra mim. Ai, ai, ai. Eu tirei essa porra da lama. Não tinha nada, agora eu tenho fama. Dinheiro tem pra família. Um troco pra minha filha não nascida. Congelei meu Rolex, me ilumina. Diamante eu pus no dedo da minha mina. Pra quem achou que era o brinca, brinca, foda-se tudo, quem manda é a 30. Foda-se tudo, quem...
Como é que é, pessoal? Estamos aí então para ver o Powell. Já sabemos os resultados, já os vou mostrar daqui a nada. Deixem-me só partilhar aqui o meu ecrã. Digam-me aí se o som está fixe, se não está. Agora já devem estar a ver a partir do meu ecrã, não? Confirmem só isso, estão a ver o ecrã ou não. Eu acho que se calhar não. Não sei porquê, mas acho que não. Capture entire screen. Ok, agora já devem estar aqui a ver, certo? Vamos ter também aqui o preço de Bitcoin em direto. Deixem-me só também ativar isso. Ok. Vou colocar o preço aí em direto em cima. Por isso deixem-me só vir aqui colocar isso. Ok, à partida já deve estar aí a aparecer também o preço de Bitcoin. Que eu arranjei aqui um widget do TradingView. Ok, espero que já esteja aí a aparecer. Já, estamos prontos para ver isso. Pá. Vou pôr só aqui. Não, eu ia pôr música de fundo, mas nem sequer vale a pena. Vou só colocar. Vamos procurar aqui o resultado das taxas de juros. Para quem não sabe, temos aqui o resultado. Eu partilhei no meu Twitter, ok? Decidiram manter entre os 4,25% e os 4,50%, que é basicamente o que já temos agora, neste momento. Ou seja, era o que já estava à espera. Para quem viu o vídeo que eu coloquei no Twitter, no TikTok, no meu Instagram, aqui no YouTube, basicamente coloquei em todo lado, antes da live, a dizer mesmo isso, que o que estava à espera era que se mantivesse igual, por isso é bullish para o mercado, certo? Agora, o mais importante vai ser quando o Powell falar agora às 6h30, porque normalmente basta ele dizer um olá mais chateado que o mercado cracha. E o mais importante, especialmente, vai ser ainda depois, quando estivermos a vê-lo a responder às perguntas. Porque, não sei se vocês estavam aí no último FOMC, mas basicamente a conferência de imprensa inteira estávamos aqui 100% tranquilos, ok? O preço de cripto estava a manter-se, estava a subir ligeiramente. No entanto, na última pergunta, perguntaram-lhe o que é que ele achava de Bitcoin e a resposta dele foi assim um bocado mais... Não digo contraditória, mas... Porque ele sempre disse que não é muito fã, certo? Mas foi assim um bocado mais forte para o lado negativo, o que fez com que a cripto descesse bastante. Por isso, vamos a ver o que é que vai acontecer agora. Eu queria procurar aqui os statements dele. Exatamente, temos aqui o statement do Federal Reserve. Certo? Exatamente. Temos o target fund rate 4,25 até 4,25 até 4,5%. Exatamente, ok, vai se manter tudo constante, lá está. Vamos ver agora o que é que vai acontecer. Até vou passar aqui para o meu perfil. Temos também aqui o True Social tudo aberto, ok? Eu vou entrar aqui no Watch Guru, está tudo aberto para vermos caso aconteça alguma coisa importante, mas lá está. Alguém entrou aí na live, não sei quem foi, o Jorge está a ver a live, vou voltar a dizer. Basicamente já temos o resultado, saiu às 6, a decisão foi de manter nos 4,25% até 4,5%, ou seja, basicamente o que já estava. Temos aqui também o release completo, ou seja, vamos manter a porcentagem que já estava, que era o que estávamos à espera, e é bullish para a cripto. Mas agora precisamos de ver o que é que vai ser dito aqui na conferência de imprensa, que isso é que vai ser sim o mais importante. Deixa eu ver se já começou, ainda não, ok. Vamos manter isto aqui para irmos ver então o que é que o Powell vai dizer. Partilhem isso aí com os vossos amigos, pessoal, deixem já aí o vosso like também, para ajudarem o canal, a ver se o YouTube recomenda. E vão comentando aí no chat em direto, usem o chat em direto para irem interagindo aí, o que vocês acharem que devem partilhar. Temos também aqui, podem ver que quando saiu aquela decisão o preço disparou consideravelmente. Por exemplo, fomos até aos 85 mil, subimos cerca de 1% aqui em Bitcoin. E Ethereum também, abrimos aqui e subimos cerca de, deixem-me só baixar isto aqui. Ethereum subiu 2%, exatamente. Ethereum subiu 2%. Boas, Gabi, então, tudo bem? Ethereum subiu 2% quando houve aquela decisão, ok? E para dar full disclosure, eu estou numa trade de Ethereum, numa long de Ethereum, muito grande, ok? Por isso, espero que aqui que vamos subir. Se não subirmos, vou fechar a trade, ok? Vou estar aqui direto, lá está, a ver isto com vocês, mas é isso. Gabi, não sei se viste o que eu estava aqui a dizer ao início, não sei se já estavas aí. A decisão saiu às 6 horas, foi manter as taxas de juro constante, que era o que já se estava à espera, por isso é bullish para o mercado de cripto, certo? A única coisa má que podia acontecer era eles dizerem que iam aumentar, mas não foi isso que aconteceu, mantiveram-se. Ok, claro que era melhor se ainda diminuíssem, mas mantiveram-se, era o que já estávamos à espera, já tinham cortado na última vez bastante, por isso estamos bem. Agora, lá está, o Paulo vai agora falar, bora lá ver isso. Gabi, diz-me aí como é que achas que está o som. Eu até vou aumentar. Diz-me aí como é que achas que está o som, a ver se ouve-se bem ou não.
Good afternoon.
Ui, está bem da baixo isto.
And I remain squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices
Está
for
bem
the
da baixo.
benefit of the American people. The economy is strong
Vocês ouvem bem?
and has made
É que para mim está
significant
muito
progress
baixo.
toward our goals over the past 2 years. Labor market conditions are solid and inflation has moved closer to our 2% longer run goal, though it remains
Gabi,
somewhat
diz-me aí se estás a ouvir
elevated.
bem. Para mim está mesmo muito baixo.
In support of our goals, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged. We also made the technical decision to slow the pace of decline in the size of our
Ok, eu
balance
gostei,
sheet.
agora acho que está fixe.
I'll have more to say about these decisions after briefly reviewing economic developments. Economic activity continued to expand at a solid pace in the fourth quarter of
Está
last
bocadinho
year,
baixo.
with GDP rising at
Não estás mesmo a imaginar
2.3%.
como é que está para mim, está mesmo muito baixo.
Recent indications, however, point to a moderation in consumer spending following the rapid growth seen over the second half of 2024.
Eu queria aumentar isto, é que eu nem estou a ouvir o gajo
Surveys
mesmo.
of households and
Não consigo
businesses
ouvir o que é que
point
está a
to
passar.
heightened uncertainty about the economic outlook.
O YouTube vou tipo dar F5.
It remains to be seen how these developments
Mano,
might
eu não
affect
consigo
future
ouvir o
spending
gajo,
and
mano.
investment.
O meu PC está todo lixado.
In our summary of economic projections, the median participant projects GDP to rise
Mano,
1.7%
deixa eu ver se
this
encontro
year,
outro canal
somewhat
qualquer
lower than
a
projected in
transmitir.
December.
É que eu não ouço mesmo nada no meu, mano. Temos Federal Reserve, que era o que eu estava a ver. Pá, eu não quero outro canais de outro pessoal. Já vamos ter de ver aqui, mano. Mas é que isto está mesmo baixo.
In the labor market, conditions remain solid. Payroll job gains averaged 200,000 per month over the
Mas
past
consegues
3
ouvir
months.
minimamente, Gabi?
The unemployment rate at 4.1% remains low and is held in a narrow range for the past year. The jobs to workers gap has held steady for several months. Wages are growing faster than inflation and at a more sustainable pace than earlier in the pandemic recovery. Overall, a wide set of
para
indicators
já está tudo
suggests
fixe,
that
para já está
conditions in the labor market are
Estás a
broadly
dizer que a
in
taxa de
balance.
desemprego baixou, que
The
é
labor
bom
market is
para a
not a
economia, é
source
bom para a
of
cripto.
significant inflationary pressures. The median projection for the unemployment rate in the SEP is 4.4% at the end of this year and 4.3% over the next 2 years. Inflation has eased significantly over the past 2 years, but remains
Sim,
somewhat
eu digo que a
elevated
inflação
relative to
diminuiu.
our 2% longer run goal. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE
Estava a
prices
perguntar
rose
se consegues ouvir, mano, o vídeo do gajo. É que a mim está muito baixo, não sei o que é que se passa.
and
Mas
that
espero que vocês
excluding the
dêem
volatile
minimamente
food
para
and
ouvir.
energy
É que a
categories,
mim quase não está
core
mesmo, nem
PCE
está em
prices
silêncio.
rose 2.8%. Some near-term measures of inflation expectations have recently moved up. We see this in both market and survey-based measures, and survey respondents, both consumers and businesses, are mentioning tariffs as a driving factor. Beyond the next year or so, however, most measures of longer-term expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation is 2.7% this year and 2.2% next year, a little higher than projected in December. In 2027, the median projection is at our 2% objective. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. At today's meeting, the committee decided to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 4.25% to 4.5%. Looking ahead, the new administration is in the process of implementing significant policy changes in four distinct areas: trade, immigration, fiscal policy, and regulation. It is the net effect of these policy changes that will matter for the economy and for the path of monetary policy.
Este discurso dele
While there
inicial,
has
pá,
been
é
recent developments in
muito
some of these
genérico,
areas, especially
que vai
trade
influenciar
policy,
mais o preço de cripto e
uncertainty
depois as
around the
perguntas que
changes
lhe
and their
fizerem. Se alguém lhe
effects on
fizer
the
uma pergunta de
economic
cripto,
outlook is
a resposta
high.
dele é que vai influenciar
As
mesmo
we
muito.
parse the incoming information, we're focused on separating the signal from the noise as the outlook
Vai
evolves.
estranho. Yeah, man, yeah.
As we say in our statement, in considering the extent and timing of additional adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. We do not need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance, and we are well positioned to wait for greater clarity.
E o ecrã está fixe, o preço do Bitcoin. Eu arranjei um widget, ele está a atualizar fixe. Está a atualizar, está constantemente a atualizar em tempo direto.
Each participant judges to be the most likely scenario going forward. An admittedly challenging exercise at this time in light of considerable uncertainty.
Depois aquele good evening.
The median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 3.9% at the end of this year and 3.4% at the end of next year, unchanged from December. While these individual forecasts are always subject to uncertainty, as I noted, uncertainty today is unusually elevated. And of course, these projections are not a committee plan or a
Enquanto não estivermos abaixo de 84, estamos
policy is
safe,
not on
mano.
a
Okay?
preset course.
Se não estivermos acima de
As the
84,
economy
estamos safe.
evolves, we will adjust our policy stance in
Para quem não
a manner
sabe,
that
mano,
best promotes our
aquela
maximum
whale que
employment
tinha
and
dado.
price stability
Para aí
goals.
depois eu digo isso, para agora não estar
If
aqui
the
a falar sobre
economy
o gajo.
remains
Mas
strong,
basicamente a whale
inflation
que
does
tinha
not
aberto uma
continue
posição
to
antes
move
de short,
sustainably toward 2%,
minutos antes do
we can
FOMC,
maintain
abriu uma
policy
short outra vez de
restraint
40
for
vezes.
longer. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly or inflation were to fall more quickly than anticipated, we can ease policy accordingly. Our current policy stance is well positioned to deal with the risks and uncertainties that we face in pursuing both sides of our dual mandate. At today's meeting, we also decided to slow the pace of decline in our balance sheet. Since we began balance sheet runoff, our securities holdings have declined by more than $2 trillion. While market indicators continue to suggest that the quantity of reserves remains abundant, we have seen some signs of increased tightness in money markets. Beginning in April, the monthly cap on Treasury redemptions will be lowered from $25 billion to $5 billion. Consistent with the committee's intention to hold primarily Treasury securities in the longer run, we are leaving the cap on agency securities unchanged. This action has no implications for our intended stance of monetary policy and should not affect the size of our balance sheet over the medium term. The committee also continued its discussions as part of our 5-year review of our monetary policy framework. At this meeting, we focused on labor market dynamics and our maximum employment goal. As we have indicated, our review will include outreach and public events involving a wide range of parties, including Fed Listens events around the country and a research conference in May. Throughout this process, we will be open to new ideas and critical feedback, and we will take on board lessons of the last 5 years in determining our findings. We intend to wrap up the review by late summer. The Fed has been assigned 2 goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation sustainably to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I will look forward to your questions.
Mano, vamos agora ver as perguntas, mano. Muita atenção nas perguntas, mano.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for your time. So, 2 things on sort of the real side here: inflation and then GDP. How much of the higher inflation forecast for this year is due to tariffs? And since the policy path remains the same, are you effectively reading this as a one-time price level shock?
Okay, so how much of it is tariff? So let me say that it is going to
para
be
já não é
very
uma pergunta
difficult
assim
to
muito
have a
impactante,
precise
ok?
assessment
Bocado,
of how
mas não
much of
muito.
inflation is coming from tariffs and from.
Quando ouvirem alguém mesmo
and
mencionar a
that's
palavra
already the
cripto
case.
ou
You may have seen
Bitcoin,
that
é que é
goods
cripto.
inflation moved up pretty significantly in the first 2 months of the year. Trying to track that back to actual tariff increases, given what was tariffed and what was not, very, very challenging. So some of it, the answer is clearly some of it. A good part of it is coming from tariffs, but we'll be working, and so will other forecasters, to try to find the best possible way to separate non-tariff inflation from tariff inflation. In terms of your sort of looking through question, too soon to say about that. As I've mentioned, it can be the case that it's appropriate sometimes to look through inflation if it's going to go away quickly without action by us, if it's transitory, and that can be the case in the case of tariff inflation. I think that would depend on the tariff inflation moving through fairly quickly, and it would depend critically as well on inflation expectations being well anchored, longer term inflation expectations being well anchored.
Well, I guess I'm looking at the out years here, and the fact that the policy path doesn't change at all, and inflation is unchanged in the out years also. Doesn't that imply you all have basically decided that there is no signal here, and that it's just we're back to transitory again?
So I think that's kind of the base case, but as I said, we really can't know that. We're going to have to see how things actually work out. And the fact that there wasn't much change, I think that's partly because you see weaker growth but higher inflation that kind of offset, and also, frankly, a little bit of inertia when it comes to changing something in this highly uncertain environment. I think there is a level of inertia where you just say, maybe I'll stay where I am.
Thank you. Colby Smith with the New York Times. You just described inflation expectations as well anchored, but has your confidence in that assessment changed at all, given the increase in certain measures and the high degree of uncertainty expressed by businesses, households, and forecasters?
So on inflation expectations, of course, we do monitor inflation expectations very, very carefully, basically every source we can find, and short-term, long-term, households, businesses, forecasters, market-based. And I think the picture broadly is this. You do see increases widely in short-term inflation expectations, and people who fill out surveys and answer questionnaires are pointing to tariffs about that. If you look in the survey world, if you look a little further out, you really don't see much in the way of an increase. Longer-term inflation expectations are mostly well anchored. If you look at the New York, for example, then you have market-based, and it's the same pattern. People in markets are pricing in break-evens. Some higher inflation over the next year must be related to tariffs. We know from the surveys. But if you look out 5 years or the 5-year forward, you'll see that break-evens are either flat or actually slightly down in the case of the longer-term one. So we look at that, and we will be watching all of it very, very carefully. We do not take anything for granted. It's at the very heart of our framework, anchored inflation expectations, but that's what you see right now.
And how much weight do you put on the deterioration in consumer confidence surveys? You said recently that this is perhaps not the best indication of future spending, but I'm curious, what you think is behind this deterioration, and to what extent it could be a leading indicator for hard data.
So let's start with the hard data. We do see pretty solid hard data still. So growth looks like it's maybe moderating a bit, consumer spending moderating a bit, but still at a solid pace. Unemployment's 4.1%. Job creation most recently has been at a healthy level. Inflation has started to move up now, we think partly in response to tariffs, and there may be a delay in further progress over the course of this year. So that's the hard data. Overall, it's a solid picture. The survey data, both household and businesses, show significant rise in uncertainty and significant concerns about downside risks. So how do we think about that? And that is the question. As I mentioned the other day, as you pointed out, the relationship between survey data and actual economic activity hasn't been very tight. There have been plenty of times where people are saying very downbeat things about the economy and then going out and buying a new car. But we don't know that will be the case here. We will be watching very carefully for signs of weakness in the real data. Of course we will. But, given where we are, we think our policy's in a good place to react to what comes, and we think that the right thing to do
quero ver o Paulo a falar assim bem, mano, é se alguém lhe perguntar de
for
Bitcoin,
greater
mano. Isso é que eu
clarity
quero.
about what the economy is doing.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, Chair Greenspan once defined price stability as an environment in which inflation is so low and stable over time that it doesn't materially enter into the decisions of households and firms.
Can you say that today, that we have that price stability, that households and businesses are ignoring price growth? When you see buy in advance psychology, big changes in inventories, and surveys that show consumers, at least in the short run, expect higher inflation.
So I do like that definition a lot. In fact, I used it at the recent conference where I spoke. So I think a world where people can make their daily economic decisions and businesses, and they're not having to think about the possibility of significantly high inflation. We know inflation will bounce around. That is price stability. I think we were getting closer and closer to that. I wouldn't say we were at that. Inflation was running around 2.5% for some time. I do think with the arrival of the tariff inflation, further progress may be delayed. The SEP doesn't really show further downward progress on inflation this year, and that's really due to the tariffs coming in. So delayed, but if you look at our forecasts, we do see ourselves getting back into the low twos in 26 and then down to 2 by 27, of course, highly uncertain. So I see progress having been made toward that, and then progress in the future. I think that progress is probably delayed for the time being.
If that's the case, why are there cuts in the SEP for 2025?
So again, people wrote down 2 cuts the last time, and they look at they wrote down meaningful decline in growth from 2.1 to 1.7 in 2025, a tick up in the unemployment rate, so not much there, but core inflation up by 0.3, and so those kind of balance each other out. So people, not everybody, but on balance, people wrote down similar numbers. The changes aren't that big. The other factor, though, as I mentioned, is just really high uncertainty. What would you write down? I mean, it's really hard to know how this is going to work out. And again, we think our policy is in a good place. We think it's a good place where we can move in the direction where we need to. But in the meantime, it's really appropriate to wait for further clarity. And of course, the costs of doing that, given that the economy is still solid, are very low.
Edward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. So with near 4% unemployment rate, that should be low enough to bring people in from the sidelines in terms of hiring. But we're seeing the hiring rates have been stuck at 2023, 2024 levels. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so that's a feature has been for some time a feature of this labor market. You have pretty high participation accounting for aging. You've got wages that are consistent with 2% inflation, assuming that we're going to keep getting relatively high productivity. We've got unemployment, pretty close to its natural level. But the hiring rate is quite low, but so is the layoff rate. So you look at initial claims or layoffs, so you're not seeing people losing their jobs, but you're seeing that people who don't have a job having to wait longer and longer. And, the question is, which way does that break? If we were to see a meaningful increase in layoffs, then that would probably translate fairly quickly into unemployment because people.
Mas ainda não houve nenhuma pergunta sobre cripto.
It's not a big
Na outra vez,
no último mês,
foi a última.
hasn't happened. What
Eles até
we've
podem não
had
fazer
is
nenhuma.
a low firing, low hiring situation, and it seems to be imbalanced now for the last 6, 7, 8 months. That's where we are. There's healthy levels of job creation too. So overall, it's a labor market that's in balance, and we watch it very carefully.
So then, have we seen the new administration's policies in economic numbers yet? And when do you anticipate that happening?
In labor or in other?
In labor and inflation, just across the economy, have we started to see the new policies take effect in the numbers?
Only in a kind of an early way. I mean, it's only been a few months, right? For example, the layoffs that are happening here are they're certainly meaningful to the people involved, and they may be meaningful to a particular neighborhood or region or area. But at the national level, they're not significant yet. But we don't know. We don't know how far that will go. We'll find out much more. I mentioned that you saw we've had two very strong goods inflation readings in the last 2 months, which is very unexpected. I think hard to trace it to specific tariffs, but it must have something to do with, it's either noise and it'll come back, and that's very possible too. But if it is persistent, then it must be to do with people buying ahead of tariffs or raising prices ahead of tariffs and things like that. Those kinds of things happen, and they're very, very hard to capture because so much of it is indirect. A great example is their washing machines were tariffed in the last round of tariffs, and prices went up. But prices also went up on dryers, which were not tariffed. So the manufacturers they just kind of followed the crowd and raised it. So things happen very indirectly. And so there'll be a lot of work done in coming months to try to trace all that through. But ultimately, though, it's too soon to be seeing significant effects in economic data.
Craig Torres from Bloomberg News. Thanks, Chair Powell. You said transitory price increases from tariffs are the base case. Transitory is the base case. Wasn't it the base case last time? And didn't the FOMC forecast lower inflation ahead last time? And wasn't the lesson that it quickly got into services, haircuts, daycare, everything else? And so I'm just wondering why the 9 aren't taking that on board and are cutting twice this year.
When you say last time, are you talking about the last time?
Yes, during the
because you could have been talking about the last time there were tariffs, in which case the inflation was transitory. Yeah, no, of course we're well aware of that, and it's still the truth. If there's an inflationary impulse that's going to go away on its own, it's not the right policy to tighten policy, because by the time you have your effect, you're in effect by design, you are lowering economic activity and employment. And if that's not necessary, you don't want to do it. In real time, as we know, it's hard to make that judgment. And we're well aware, of what happened, obviously, with the pandemic inflation. But I mean, we have to look at this as a different situation. There are differences and similarities. I mean, it's a different time. We haven't had real price stability fully reestablished yet, and we have to keep that in mind. And we also we hear that people are very reluctant to take on to allow prices to go up. At the same time, we hear that businesses are intending to pass many of these prices through. So it's hard to say how this is going to work out.
E se não falar sequer, mas estamos fixe.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Thanks for taking my question, Mr. Chairman. The Bank of Canada, in its last policy statement, said monetary policy cannot offset the impacts of a trade war. What it can and must do is ensure that higher prices do not lead to ongoing inflation. I wonder if that kind of reflects your own sense of prioritization faced with higher prices and weaker growth, that the idea is you have to take care of inflation.
So we have two goals, right? We have maximum employment and price stability, and we have to balance those. And there can be situations in which they're in tension, right? And we actually have a provision in our consensus statement that says what we should do in that case. That's a very challenging situation for any central bank, and certainly for us. And so what we say that we'll do is we'll look how far each of those two goals is, each of those two measures is from its goal, and then we'll ask how long we think it might take to get back to the goal for each of them, and we'll make a judgment, because our tools work in one direction. We're either tightening or loosening. So it's a very challenging situation. Let me say, we don't have that situation right now. That's not where the economy is at all. It's also not where the forecast is. I don't know any mainstream forecast that really shows significant problems like that.
Well, just to follow up, yesterday the UCLA Anderson forecast said there's a high probability of a recession. Where do you stand on whether or not the slowdown you're seeing creates a high probability of concern that you may have on recession? Thank you.
There's always an unconditional possibility of a recession. It might be broadly in the range of 1 in 4 at any time. If you look back through the years, it could be within 12 months a 1 in 4 chance of a recession. So the question is whether that whether this current situation, those possibilities are elevated. I will say this. We don't make such a forecast. If you look at outside forecasts, forecasters have generally raised, a number of them have raised their possibility of a recession somewhat, but still at relatively moderate levels, still in the region of the traditional, because they were extremely low. If you go back 2 months, people were saying that the likelihood of a recession was extremely low. So has moved up, but it's not high.
Ok, mas não foi má a resposta, não foi má. Acho que mentiu, mas não foi má.
Hi, thank you. Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. As you know, I guess last night President Trump fired 2 members of the Federal Trade Commission, an independent agency, and this could cause the kind of legal fight about the administration's power to fire independent people. If those firings stand, is that a threat to the Fed's independence? Could he do the same thing to the Fed board?
So I think I did answer that question in this very room some time ago, and I have no desire to change that answer, and I have nothing new for you on that today.
Well, maybe I'll have another mulligan. As you know, I wanted to go back to the consumer sentiment, particularly the inflation expectations in the University of Michigan survey. In the summer of 2022, you cited the rise in the long-term inflation expectations in that index as the reason that you went big with a 3/4 point hike. So I know you've talked about all the different measures now, but you seem to not be placing the same weight on that. And so I'm just wondering, are you dismissing that, what we saw last week from the University of Michigan, or does that carry the same weight as it did in the past?
So I mentioned it back then, but in no way did I place a huge weight on it. I think that was a ex post story, but it wasn't the case. That was a preliminary reading, and so is this. And it's also, this is that Michigan, the one you're referring to, the longer term thing. We look at it, we don't dismiss data that we don't like, we force ourselves to look at it, but it is an outlier compared to market-based and compared to other survey-based assessments of longer run inflation expectations. So we got to keep that in mind. And I would just say we look at all of them, and that one's kind of an outlier, but nonetheless we take notice of it.
Thank you.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. There's a worry on Wall Street that when you say you want to study the net effect of the fiscal policies we may see on the economy, that you would end up waiting too long and be behind the curve in responding to any downturn. How can you reassure people that you can spot a problem early enough unless you decide to be preemptive?
Yeah, look, we're aware of we're well aware of how things are going to evolve and the time frames and all that, and we will use our tools to foster achievement of our goals to the best we can, and of course we're going to try to be timely with that. For right now, the hard data are pretty solid. We are obviously aware of the soft sentiment data and high uncertainty, and we're watching that carefully, and we think it's a good time for us to wait for further clarity before we consider adjusting our policy stance.
Do you think it's going to be hard to get clarity in the government by tweet? I mean, do you have a feeling that at some point you actually will have a forecast you can trust?
Yes, I think we will. It's hard to say when that will be. These decisions are going to be made, and they're going to be implemented, and then we'll know. At that point, we'll know what the decisions are, and we'll have to make assessments then about the implications for the economy. Those things will happen. A lot of them will happen over the course of, in coming months, certainly over the course of this year, and we'll be adapting as we go.
Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. At the beginning, you were talking about separating the signal from the noise and tariff inflation from non-tariff inflation. Can you walk us through what that looked like over the last couple of months, if there were specifics from the January meeting to now that helped you make those distinctions?
So when we say separating the signal from the noise, that's just a way of saying that things are highly uncertain, and that you're reading about developments. The news is full of developments of tariffs being put on and taken off and things like that. Some of that is noise in the sense that it's not really telling you anything. You're trying to extract a signal from that, and the signal is what's going to be the effect on economic activity, on inflation, on employment, and all those things. So So that's really when we say signal and noise. Sorry, the second thing was?
Or similarly for tariff inflation, non-tariff inflation, ways that you're making the distinction.
That's sort of a special case of that. The idea being, and I do think that the first 2 months of this year are a great example. You've got high readings for goods inflation after a string of readings that average close to zero. And you have to ask, it's coming during tariffs, but you can't, it's very hard to actually scientifically go back and match up those increases and say, yes, I can prove that that's from tariffs, but it kind of has to be to some extent. Idiosyncratic readings in various categories, which will shortly reverse, and that happens too, and that could be a big piece of it. I think we'll know. In a couple of months, we'll know whether those were where that really was from. But that's another case where I think it's going to be very, very challenging to unpack the inflation that we see over the course of this year and be able to say with confidence how much of that came from inflation and how much of it, from tariffs and how much of it didn't. But that's what we'll be doing. We'll be doing that, and so will everybody else, and we'll all be trying very hard to make that assessment. And, I'm sure we will make a lot of progress on that, and we already have.
Do you have a sense yet as to what, in your mind, would make something cross from noise to a signal, what that threshold would look like?
It would depend on what we're talking about. Obviously, you're looking for direct evidence that particular pieces of inflation are or clearly not caused by tariffs. For example, if it's something that was, in the service sector that was far away from anything that's tariffed, you might think, okay, well, that is, like, frankly, housing services inflation, which, by the way, has been behaving well, which for some time was kind of our problem. Now it's slow, but it's definitely, moving down in a very good way. It's more now with goods and to some extent with non-housing services inflation.
Thanks for taking our questions, Chair Powell. Kelly O'Grady, CBS News. So consumer sentiment has dipped dramatically, but you say the economy and the hard data is still solid. What is your message to consumers that clearly disagree and don't feel that strength? Because the hard data they're looking at is their grocery bill.
Okay, so a couple things. The grocery bill is about past inflation, really. There was inflation in 21, 2, and 3, and prices went up. The current level, it's not the change in prices. It's they're unhappy, and they're not wrong to be unhappy that prices went up quite a bit, and they're paying a lot for those things. So I think that is the fundamental fact, and has been for a long time, a couple of years, why people are unhappy with the economy. It's not that the economy is not growing. It's not that inflation is really high. It's not that unemployment is high. It's none of those things. We have, 4.1% unemployment. We've got 2% growth, and it's a pretty good economy. But people are unhappy because of the price level, and we completely understand and accept that.
And just to follow up, why are you still projecting 2 rate cuts this year if your own projections show inflation higher for longer? Does that mean you see a slowdown in economic growth as a real threat?
So I think remember we came into this with, at the December meeting, the median was 2 cuts, the median was. And so you come in and you see, broadly speaking, weaker growth but higher inflation. And they kind of balance each other out. So you think, and unemployment is there's really only a 1/10 change. So there's just not a big change in the forecast. There really isn't. Modest, meaningfully higher growth and meaningfully higher inflation, which call for different responses, right? So they cancel each other out, and people just said, okay, I'm going to stay here. But the second factor is it's so highly uncertain. Is just, we're sitting here thinking, and we obviously are in touch with businesses and households all over the country. We have an extraordinary network of contacts that come in through the reserve banks and put in the beige book, and also through contacts at the board. And we get all that, and we do understand that sentiment has fallen off pretty sharply, but economic activity has not yet. And so we're watching carefully. So I would tell people that the economy seems to be healthy. We understand that sentiment is quite negative at this time, and that probably has to do with turmoil at the beginning of an administration that's making big changes in areas of policy, and that's probably part of it. I do think the underlying unhappiness people have about the economy, though, is more about the price level.
Foi bocado não muito bom esta
Hi,
pergunta.
Victoria Guida with Politico. I wanted to ask, first of all, if you could clarify, you were talking about how tariffs were a good part of the uptick in the inflation forecast, and I was just wondering what that specifically refers to. Is that the tariffs that have already been put in place? Is that anticipating some of the tariffs that might be coming on April 2nd? And then also, if you wouldn't mind, talking a little more about the balance sheet decision and what drove that. Did that have anything to do with expectations of how the debt ceiling, raising the debt ceiling, might affect the reserve supply?
Yeah, so in the SEP, you'll see that there's not further progress on core inflation this year. We're kind of flatlining, going sideways. We don't ask people to write down how much of this is from tariffs and how much of it is not. But some of it is from tariffs. We know that tariffs are coming in. We know that they're probably already, all forecasters have tariff inflation affecting core PCE inflation, core CPI inflation this year, without exception. I'm not aware of an exception. So it's in there. I can't tell you how much of that it is. In terms of the balance sheet, so yeah, I think, I guess the way I'd say it is, it was the flows in and out of the TGA that got us thinking about it. But as we thought about it, we really came to the view that this was a good time to make the move that we made. And broadly, committee came around to the view that we would do the same thing we'd already done, which is I guess in June, was it June? Whenever it was, we lowered the pace of QT, and we're just going to do that again. We're going to cut it roughly in half. And the sense of that is, if you're cutting the pace of QT roughly in half, then the runway is probably doubled. Okay, so it's going to be slower for longer. And people really like that. People thought that's a good idea. It's like a plane. You can think of it like a plane coming in for a landing. As we get closer, and we by the way, we still think that reserves are abundant, although you begin to see some of the things we look at begin to react a little bit, but we still think that they're abundant. And of course, now the TGA is emptying out, so reserves are higher now, so you can't really see the underlying signal. So we came around to the view, and it had a lot of appeal, and so we did it. It has no implications at all for monetary policy. It has no implications at all for the ultimate size of the balance sheet. It isn't sending a signal in any hidden way that you can try to tease out. It's just not there. We're basically, it's very consistent with our plans and our practices that we've published and that we've followed since we began this, what is a very successful rundown of the balance sheet. Again, the second time that we've slowed the pace, and we've said that we would stop when we were somewhat above the level we judge as ample. And clearly we're not at that level yet, but we're going to be approaching it more slowly. It's a common sense kind of a thing, and it had pretty broad appeal, I will say.
Claire Jones, Financial Times. You said in January, Chair Powell, that inflation expectations remained well anchored. Would you still say they remain well anchored today? And just to reiterate the question others have asked, if they're not so well anchored, why hasn't there been a more radical shift to the policy path today? Thank you.
Não percebi nada da pergunta
So
dela.
when we talk
Estava
about
muito baixo isto.
inflation expectations being well anchored, we're talking about longer run inflation expectations. And they really haven't moved much. I mean, if at all. There's one reading that everyone's focusing on that's higher, but the other survey readings and the market-based readings all show relatively, well-anchored inflation expectations. You would expect that expectations of inflation over the course of a year would move around because conditions change, and in this case, we have tariffs coming in. We don't know how big, what's big. There's so many things we don't know, but we kind of know there are going to be tariffs, and they tend to bring growth down. They tend to bring inflation up in the first instance. So I would say, I'm not dismissing what we're seeing in short-term inflation expectations. We, as I mentioned, follow that very carefully. But when we say expectations are well anchored, we're really looking at longer terms, 5-year and out, and there's really no story to tell 5 years and out, either in market-based or in surveys. But we'll watch it. I mean, we're not we're not going to miss any evidence that longer-term or medium-term inflation expectations are moving.
Chair Powell, Neil Irwin with Axios. Treasury Secretary Bessent has observed that a large share of job growth over the last couple of years has been in what he calls government or government-adjacent sectors, healthcare, education. Do you agree that there's some weakness in underlying private job growth, and do you see the composition of job growth as something that has policy implications?
So that has been the case. We talked about that over the course of the last year. There were some good number of months and times when a lot of the job creation was concentrated in, educational institutions, healthcare, state governments, things like that. There were also times when private sector job growth has been moving in a healthy range. I mean, they're all jobs, but and remember, we're at very low unemployment for quite a time now. So I think it's a good labor market, but it's something that we monitor carefully. From our standpoint, employment is employment. But the elected government is entitled to have, we don't have policies that address different kinds of employment, but the elected government has a different role, and they can have those.
Here's a quick QT question. Does the committee envision at some point tapering the MBS runoff as well?
I think tapering it, I don't know. There's no plan to do that. At a certain point, we'll stop runoff. And we may or may not stop MBS runoff, though, because, we want to stop runoff in net at some point. We haven't made any decisions about that. We want the MBS to roll off our balance sheet. We really strongly desire that. So, but we haven't made any decisions about that. I think we'd look carefully at letting that keep going, but hold the overall size of the balance sheet in, constant at some point, a point that we're not at yet.
Simon. Simon Rabinovich with The Economist. Thank you, Chair Powell. Several times today you said that you feel you're well positioned to wait for greater clarity. At the same time, you could point to quite a few growth risks at the moment. We've seen a stock market that's gone quite wobbly, rapidly cooling housing sales, plunge in confidence surveys. Today, not only did the S&P mark down the growth outlook, 17 of 19 see risks to the downside. So my question is, how confident are you that you're well positioned, or is that one more thing that you're uncertain about?
I'm confident that we're well positioned in the sense that we're well positioned to move in the direction we'll need to move. I don't know anyone who has a lot of confidence in their forecast. I mean, the point is we are at we're at a place where we can cut, or we can hold what is clearly a restrictive stance of policy, and that's what I mean. I think that's well positioned. Forecasting right now, forecasting is always very, very hard, and in the current situation, I just think uncertainty is remarkably high.
And sorry, standing here today, would you be surprised to pivot back towards rate cuts in May?
I think we're not going to be in any hurry to move, and as I mentioned, I think we're well positioned to wait for further clarity, and not in any hurry.
Matt
Egan with CNN. Thank you, Chair Powell. The Fed statement released today removed a line that previously said the committee judges that the risks to achieving its employment and inflation goals are roughly in balance. Can you explain the decision to remove that line? Does it mean that you're now more concerned about inflation or about employment?
Actually, it does not mean either of those things. Sometimes with language, it lives its useful life, and then we take it off, and that was the case here. There's really not meant to be any signal here. Over the past year, conveying the sense of the balance of risks was important, that they be in balance or close to being in balance. That was useful as we approached liftoff, if you remember. But we're past that. Beginning to cut. So we just took it out. I actually would say that the more important thing now about risks, and this is in the pages like 10, 11, 12 of the SEP, if you look, participants widely raised their estimate of the risks to of uncertainty, but also of the risks to growth and our employment and inflation mandates. That's a more salient point now than whether they're in balance.
Just on the stock market has obviously declined significantly since the Fed last met. Are you concerned at all about some of the market volatility having a real economic impact in terms of hurting business spending or consumer spending, especially among higher income households?
Financial conditions matter to us because, financial conditions are the main channel to the real economy through which our policy has its effects. So they're important. But what matters from a Fed standpoint for the macro economy is material changes to overall financial conditions that are persistent, that last for a while, long enough to actually affect economic activity. So that's what we're looking for. I'm not going to opine on the appropriate level of any market, equity, debt, commodities, or anything like that. And I would just point you to the bigger picture again. The real economy, the hard data, are still in reasonably good shape. It's the soft data, it's the surveys that are showing significant concerns, downside risks, and those kind of things. We don't dismiss that. We're watching it carefully, but we don't want to get ahead of that. We want to focus on the hard data. If that's going to affect the hard data, we should know it very quickly, and of course we'll understand that. But you don't see that yet.
Jennifer. Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. As you look to navigate higher inflation and lower growth, the Fed has talked about heeding the lessons from the 1970s. Is the Fed willing to have a recession if it means breaking the back of inflation?
Well, fortunately, we're in a situation where we have seen inflation move down from higher levels to pretty close to 2%. While the unemployment rate has remained very consistent with full employment, 4.1%. So we now have inflation coming in from an exogenous source, but the underlying inflationary picture before that was, basically 2.5% inflation, I would say, and 2% growth and 4% unemployment. So that's what we did. That's what together the economy accomplished. So I don't see any reason to think that we're looking at a replay of the 70s or anything like that. Underlying inflation is still running in the twos with probably a little bit of a pickup associated with tariffs. So I don't think we're facing, I wouldn't say we're in a situation that's remotely comparable to that.
And last month, the idea of a Doge dividend was proposed, which would send $5,000 checks to every taxpayer from Doge savings. President Trump and Elon Musk have supported this. There's reports there could be a bill introduced on Capitol Hill. What impact might that have on household savings and spending in terms of your growth and outlook for inflation?
It's not appropriate for me to speculate on political ideas or fiscal policy for that matter, so I'm gonna pass on that one. Thank you.
Daniel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Daniel Avis from Agence France Presse. You mentioned that tariffs are already having at least some impact on inflation. I'm just wondering how you and your colleagues on the FOMC have been thinking about the possibility of retaliatory tariffs from other countries, especially with April the 2nd coming up. Was it something you considered during this meeting? Thanks.
So since the very beginning, we've had kind of a placeholder. The staff has a placeholder of a range of possible outcomes from tariffs and from trade policy generally, and they generally assume full retaliation in those, and so that's kind of baked into the numbers. What happens? It will be complicated, and there will be some retaliation and some not, and all that. But ultimately, they're trying to, with the placeholder, give us a broad sense of what this might look like. When we actually know the specifics, we'll be able to have still uncertain but better informed forecasts. So yes, that's in there.
Last question goes to Jean.
Hi, Chair Powell. Jean Young with M&I Market News. Had a couple questions on the balance sheet change that you made. So the minutes had initially described your discussion on slowing QT as temporary until the debt ceiling is resolved. But from what you said earlier, it doesn't sound like there's a desire to kind of regain the pace of QT that we have at the moment after the debt ceiling is resolved. Is that the case?
Yeah, so we looked at pausing and we looked at slowing, and really people came together very strongly behind slowing, not pausing. for a variety of reasons. And so people really came to be, pretty strongly in favor of this move. It slows down the path and probably lengthens it, doubles it effectively by slowing it by half. That people thought that's a good place to be. It'll help us assure that this path is a smooth one as we get closer and closer to that. So that's how that came about.
Well, I guess my question is more, was that meant to be a temporary measure during the debt ceiling episode, or?
It was the TGA flows, Treasury General Account flows, that got us thinking about this. But the more we thought about it, we came around to this. And it is, yes, it was provoked. The original discussion was provoked by that. But I think what we came up with, though, was broader than that and different than that. It does address that issue, but it really is also, it fits in really nicely with our principles and our plans and the things we've done before and the things we said we would do. So that's why, pretty strong support. I'd just say it's nothing to do with monetary policy, nothing to do with the size of the balance sheet. It's just kind of a common sense adjustment as you get closer and closer. Let's slow down a little bit again, and that way we'll be more and more confident that we're getting where we need to get. You can take our time getting there. We're shrinking the balance sheet every month, and we think it was a good play, and as I mentioned, well supported. Thanks very much.
Ok, não foi mal. Não falámos que é de cripto. Por isso, à partida, vamos subir, pessoal. À partida, temos tudo para subir. Deixem-me só passar aqui para a câmera. Ou seja, vamos ver então o que é que aconteceu. Temos as taxas de juro a manterem-se constantes, certo? Okay. As taxas de juro estão constantes, era o que já estávamos à espera, por isso, não há assim grande problema. Depois, temos o Powell, que pela primeira vez no FOMC não falou porcaria sobre cripto. Por isso, à partida, a meu ver, temos o que é necessário para subir. Já subimos 1.500 paus desde que começou a live, não é? Estamos aqui a 85.500, chegámos quase ali aos 86.000. Vamos então ver como é que isto vai continuar. Vou voltar aqui a partilhar o ecrã e vamos ver aqui o mercado. Ou seja, temos esta candle que foi agora durante o FOMC. Subimos 2,6%. E Ethereum também, chegou a estar abaixo dos 2.000, chegou a ir aos 2.060. Ethereum está bem, mas a Ethereum começou a subir já hoje, durante o dia. Podem ver que, por exemplo, ontem às 6 da tarde, estávamos em 1.874 e desde aí já subimos 10%. Ou seja, em 24 horas, 25 horas, subimos 10%, o que é algo incrível, mesmo para o mercado de cripto. Agora, o que é que vai acontecer? Estamos aqui a corrigir um bocado. Se calhar o pessoal também podia estar à espera que fosse falar de cripto e que fossem falar de uma forma bullish. Mas é o que eu digo. Eu acho que é melhor não falar de todo do que falar de forma má e pejorativa. Mas não sei. Gabi, ainda estás aí? Não estás? Se estiveres, diz aí o que é que tu achaste. Se tens alguma dúvida. Estou a dizer para o Gabi, porque eu sei que está aí. Agora, quem também tiver, está à vontade, claro, para falar. Digam aí o que é que vocês acharam. Deixa eu ver aqui o Watcher Guru. Adormeceste mesmo, mano? Estás a falar a sério? Fogo, mano, como assim? Só acordei devido ao grito. What? Deixa eu ver o que é que ele disse aqui, ó. Jerome Powell disse que a inflação está a subir parcialmente por causa das taxas dos impostos do Trump. Essa foi aquela pergunta que eu disse que não foi assim lá muito boa, certo? Depois tinha dito aqui, lá está que não precisa estar com pressa para ajustar as taxas de juros. Ok, pronto, aqui não temos assim nada por aí além. Deixa eu ver o que é que o Trump disse. Deixa-me vir aqui ao Truth Social do Trump. Ele aqui a dizer que, não sei quem é esta repórter, não é? Da Fox, que ela assistiu durante o fim de semana e que ela é mesmo muito má, que devia trabalhar para a CNN e não para a Fox. O que é que o Will me disse aqui?
Without President Trump, this would be impossible. So I'd just like to say, it's only possible with this president. And we've got this narrow window of opportunity with a House, Senate, and a popular vote, and really we're just implementing the will of the people.
Não tem nada a ver, é outro assunto qualquer. Epá, estamos a ver aqui o preço a corrigir e não sei se vai realmente corrigir muito mais ou não. Lá está, tipo, a meu ver, não acho que temos assim grande motivo para corrigir. A única coisa má que foi dita foi aquilo que vamos ver agora, que o Powell disse que o mercado está assim um bocado mal por causa das taxas do Trump, mas tipo, isso aí o pessoal já sabia. Aliás, quando o Trump colocou as taxas foi quando houve aquelas correções enormes, mas o próprio Trump disse, não se importava, que foi aquela pergunta que fizeram ao Powell, que esperava que ele não respondesse igual ao Trump, e não respondeu ainda bem, porque uma coisa era o Trump, outra coisa é o Powell, que é aqui do Fed, não é? É completamente diferente. Mas que o Trump tinha dito que não se importava de levar o mercado numa montanha russa se garantisse o futuro da economia. Ou seja, basicamente o que ele quer dizer com isso é não se importa de descer as cenas se depois garantir que a economia está boa. Basicamente vai descer as cenas, comprar mais barato e depois só. Que foi o que aconteceu, certo? Nós estávamos a 100 mil dólares, viemos até aos 79, 78, 77, aliás, 77. Agora, neste momento eu não vejo motivo para descermos mais. É que estou mesmo cansado e a voz do gajo ainda por cima é baixa. Não, mano, a live stream é que estava mesmo baixa. Não sei, tu não estás mesmo a ver como é que eu estava. Mas pronto. Agora, outra cena que eu vos queria mostrar. Antes de começar esta live, eu publiquei um vídeo, passem por lá se não viram ainda, no TikTok, no YouTube Shorts e no Instagram, sobre a Whale, que tinha aberto aqui há uns tempos, não sei se lembram, aquela posição, uma short de 500 milhões com 40 vezes de leverage em Bitcoin, e depois fechou, certo? A mesma Whale que já tinha dado long antes do Trump anunciar que iria haver uma estratégia, uma reserva estratégica da cripto. Ou seja, muito provavelmente é algum insider que sabe algumas cenas que nós não sabemos. Não é garantido, mas provavelmente. E essa mesma Whale abriu, antes do FOMC, outra short de 40 vezes. E eu quero ver como é que está a posição. Se ele fechou, se não fechou. Ou seja, podem ver aqui. Vamos ver aqui também em direto. Foi uma short mais pequena, mas... Ui! E ele mudou o nome dele, aqui da wallet, mudou para Melania. E a descrição foi Melania will flip Trump. What? Mano, só por curiosidade, deixem ver o market cap da Melania e o market cap do Trump. Antes de vermos aí a posição do gajo, deixem-me só aqui ver. Trump, USDT. Hã? Porquê é que não aparece? Qual é? É este, não é? Acho que é este. Official Trump. Deixa-me ver o market cap. 2,25 bis, ok? E o da Melania? Official Trump, é. Mano, o da Melania está com 400 milhões, mano. Mano, deixa-me só fazer aqui umas continhas. Ok, 2,25 bis, certo? Dividido por 390 milhões. Ou seja, ele está a querer dizer que Melania vai dar outplay a Trump por quase 6 vezes. Ou seja, se Trump der 1 vezes 2, Melania vai dar 1 vezes 12. Mano, isso era uma boa play. Mas não sei, mano, não sei. Agora eu quero ver aqui as posições dele, mano. Onde é que estão as posições dele, mano? Eu acho que ele fechou. Deixem-me abrir no Hyperliquid, que eu acho que ele tinha lá. Mano, temos Bitcoin a descer dos 85. Estou a considerar se fecho a minha posição ou não. Deixa-me ver aqui as posições dele. Ele fechou, ele abriu uma long aqui em Jelly. Mas querem ver, ele tinha aberto uma short. Até vou procurar e ele fechou a short, deve ter sido agora, mano. Deixa-me procurar. Mano, se ele tiver fechado... Exato, olha aqui, ele close short. Eu vou-vos mostrar que ele tinha aberto a short. Certo? Mano, isto era uma short enorme, mano. Ele teve de fechar isso em tantas vezes. Olha aqui, ele tinha aberto short às 7 em Bitcoin. Às 7? Mano, não, ele já tinha aberto antes, mano. Ele já tinha aberto antes, que isso eu sei. Se calhar abriu foi outra. Deixa-me procurar aqui. E aí não dá para ver mais para trás. Mas ele já tinha aberto uma short em Bitcoin antes. Ou seja, mas às 7 pelos vistos ele aumentou o valor, ok? Aumentou o valor da short e depois fechou-a, mano. Deixa eu ver quando é que ele fechou. Ele fechou a... Mano, como é que o gajo aumentou a posição às 7 horas e fechou às 7h03, mano? Ele está-nos a dar uma tanga. Mas já, o gajo fechou. Neste momento ele só tem uma long de 3 vezes em Jelly. Mano, eu acho que ele está-nos a dar aqui tanga. A ver se nos baralha um bocadinho. Mas... o que é que será que vai acontecer agora, mano? Mano, eu tenho um stop loss aqui. 1900 e... mais ou menos nesta zona, estão a ver? Porque tínhamos aqui... Tenho que pôr lá a linha. Eu posso pôr lá a linha para vos mostrar melhor. E pus um stop loss na minha posição de Ethereum, mais ou menos assim aqui. Porque temos aqui resistência, aqui resistência, aqui resistência, aqui resistência, aqui resistência, ou seja, estávamos ali com bastante resistência. Então, caso quebremos aquilo, muito provavelmente vamos descer pelo menos até aos 1800. Por isso eu pus o stop loss aqui. Estou a pensar só se aumenta ou não. Mas acho que não. Se pusesse seria aqui. Deixa-me passar isto só para o gráfico de 4 horas. Poderia colocar aqui se calhar. Tipo 1900. Aqui se calhar 1980. Se calhar vou aumentar, passar para 1980. Deve fazer isso em live. Deixem-me ver. Até posso mostrar a minha posição para vocês verem o quão absurda é. Mas deixem-me só passar por aqui stop loss 1980. Ok, tá. Agora queria-vos mostrar. Já guardei. Posso-vos mostrar aqui. Deixa eu passar isto para vídeo. Ok, já devem depois estar a ver o meu vídeo. Vejam aqui se conseguem ver a posição, mano. Não sei se conseguem ver. Certo? Mano, peraí, deixa-me desligar aqui a luz. Senão se calhar não dá para ver também. Vocês conseguem ver mais ou menos, certo? Conseguem ver, acho eu. Está aí com quase 250% em lucros. Mas também tenho a dizer que foi assim um bocado uma cena absurda. Vocês podem ver 42 vezes de leverage, certo? Não vos recomendo, ok? Isto não é aconselhamento financeiro de tudo. Mas estamos aí com bastantes lucros. 250% de lucros. Eu entrei em 1907, ou seja, entrei aqui. Estão a ver? Aqui. Foi quando quebrámos aqui esta resistência. Quando quebrámos esta resistência eu pus aqui a long 42 vezes de leverage. Ou seja, foi ontem à noite, basicamente. Foi ontem à noite. E depois tivemos aqui um bocado de saídas durante a noite, mas também estava a dormir, para mim não me fez diferença. Acordei e logo de manhã esta subida que soube tão bem. Agora, lá está. Eu tenho o stop loss aqui em 1980 que eu pus, não foi? Acho que foi. Ou seja, basicamente é aqui. Porque se chegar a esse ponto, muito provavelmente vamos pelo menos até aos 40, ou então até aos 1900, ou então até 1825. Pá, deixa-me tirar esta linha. Eu não sei porque esta linha aparece sempre, mano. Que maluco, 40 vezes. Mano, imagina, sabe o que é que aconteceu? Basicamente, eu vou-vos dizer. Basicamente, o que aconteceu foi... Estão a ver aqui, certo? Este pontinho mesmo mínimo, ok? Eu entrei ali. Porquê? Porque eu aqui estava para entrar, certo? Estava mesmo para entrar. E não entrei e vi que isto desceu. E eu disse para mim próprio, se chegarmos aos 1825, que era este suporte, eu vou abrir uma long enorme. É enorme em termos de leverage, atenção, não é em termos de capital. E depois chegámos, estávamos aqui em 1825, certo? E durante cerca de 30 segundos eu pensei, vamos descer mais, não vou abrir. Porque tínhamos aquela whale com uma short também enorme aberta. Mas depois eu pensei, não mano, tu disseste a ti próprio que vais abrir, tu vais abrir. Então, literalmente, eu podia ter aberto a 25, ok? Podia ter por ordem para comprar a 25, não pus. E quando abri estava a 22, que foi o mínimo. Posso ver aqui. Onde é que está? O mínimo foi 21. E eu abri a 22, 40 vezes de leverage, ok? 40 vezes, ok? Começou a subir. Chegámos para aí, aqui, mais ou menos. Acho que foi para aí aqui. Ou seja, não foi praticamente nada, mano. Foi assim uma cena, foi tipo 2%. Não foi praticamente nada. E eu vi a descer, que foi esta candle aqui também, ok? Podem ver esta candle. E pensei, não mano, o gajo tem a short aberta, isto vai mesmo descer. E fechei, ou seja, fechei com lucros. Já não fechei ali no topo, né? Fechei para aí aqui, ou seja, não fechei com muitos lucros, mas fechei com alguns lucros. E depois, mano, vejo esta cena aqui a subir, mano. Depois vejo isto, assim aqui. E eu fiquei possuído, mano. Fiquei, mano, devia ter seguido o meu próprio instinto e deixado a trade aberta. Então, depois, quando eu vi aqui isto a quebrar, aqui, estás a ver esta resistência em 1904, eu disse, não vai acontecer duas vezes. Pá, se perder este capital que se lixe, também não é muito, ok? Não pus lá muito dinheiro na trade, só que é com muito leverage, ou seja, apesar de não ser muito, torna-se uma trade grande. E, eu tenho essa trade aberta, vou levá-la até fechar o CME Gap. Eu, por acaso, estou aqui com uma dúvida. Também não sei o que é que vocês acham, pá, podem dar a vossa opinião se quiserem. Que é, eu estou na dúvida se vou fechar aqui, quando fecharmos este CME Gap não é este. Quando fecharmos este CME Gap a 2633, o que, de onde eu entrei, seria, estão aqui a ver, 38%, ok, podem fazer, eu posso fazer aqui as contas para vos mostrar, 38% vezes, não é assim, é assim, 38% vezes 42, que foi a leverage que eu pus, dá-me 16 vezes o dinheiro que eu pus. Ou seja, eu posso tirar ali com 16 vezes o dinheiro que eu pus, ou esperava fechar o outro CME Gap, que é aqui a cerca de 3 mil e pouco, que é 71%. Ou seja, 71 vezes 42, 30 vezes. Ou seja, eu posso tirar a 16 vezes ou posso tirar a 30. E agora, claro que se fosse só assim, era óbvio, era tirar a 30, não é? Mas agora vou-vos dizer qual é a catch, digamos assim. É que... primeiro eu não sei porque é que isto está assim com estas linhas, mano. Estou-me a passar com aquilo, mas está-se bem. Vamos passar aqui ao gráfico controlador. O que eu acho que vai acontecer é o que eu já disse aqui noutros vídeos, que é... Eu acho que nós vamos subir assim até aos 2633, como eu estava a dizer. Fechar o primeiro gap. Descer... pelo menos até aqui aos 2570, ou seja, não é assim uma descida muito grande, certo? Podem ver aqui, isto aqui é o quê? Isto são para aí 2%. É tipo 2%, ou seja, não é assim muito. E depois sem subir. Mas também há a possibilidade de subir até aqui, descer primeiro assim um bocado, tipo, sei lá, se calhar para até aqui, depois voltar a subir e aí sim. Ou seja, eu estou na dúvida, lá está, se tiro os profits aqui, para, se descer, voltar a entrar ou aqui, ou aqui, ou aqui, ou onde for. Só que estou sujeito a que, lá está, se fosse só esta descida aqui, não é assim muito grande. Ou seja, estou sujeito a que nem consiga entrar na trade. Pode descer de repente e subir. Mas ao mesmo tempo, se descer assim mais considerável, posso entrar depois com muito mais capital, que vai ser esses lucros. E levar até o CME Gap. Eu estou mesmo indeciso, não sei o que é que hei de fazer. Mas, para já, Digam-me aí a vossa opinião, mas para já está para fechar no primeiro CME Gap, mas não sei. Não sei mesmo. Deixa-me só confirmar aqui o preço do segundo CME Gap. É 3.346. Segue o teu instinto, até agora acertaste as cenas. Pá, mas o meu instinto nisto está mesmo dividido. Eu acho, se calhar, que vou Pá, deixem-me só ver aqui a diferença em capital. Como é que é aqui? 3.346. Literalmente dá-me tipo o dobro do dinheiro. É o que tínhamos visto. Espera aí, deixa-me pensar aqui numa coisa que eu vou precisar. É que a minha posição neste momento, eu estou a pensar, certo? Minha posição... Eu acho que se calhar vou colocar o preço dali, 3.346, para fechar a posição por completo. E acho que vou colocar os 2.633, certo? A tirar metade do dinheiro. E se tirar esta metade do dinheiro... eu acho que vai ser isso, pessoal. Acho que vou tirar metade do dinheiro. Ok, fiz isso. Coloquei essas ordens. Coloquei a fechar metade da posição no primeiro e o resto no segundo. Qual é a minha ideia? Deixa-me passar aqui outra vez para aqui. A minha ideia vai ser tirar metade do dinheiro, lá está, onde eu disse, certo? Onde é que está aqui? Okay, está aqui. Vai ser tirar metade do dinheiro aqui em cima, 2.633. Se simplesmente dispararmos, vou ter a outra metade aberta. Ok, ninguém morre, está-se bem, não lucro tanto. Mas nunca ninguém morreu por tirar sempre lucros, não é? É melhor lucros do que prejuízos, como se costuma dizer. E o que é que eu vou fazer com essa metade de dinheiro que tirar aqui? Se descermos, faz de conta que descemos até, sei lá, até aqui, não é? Para testar isto. Voltei a entrar com mais um bocado de capital, não todo. Porquê é que eu digo não todo? Porque o resto eu vou investir em spot, ok? Pai, metade desse dinheiro que eu tirar, ou seja, eu vou tirar metade da posição e dessa metade que eu tirar, metade vou colocar em spot para não correr riscos. A outra metade vou esperar para uma entry. Se tivermos a entry temos, se não tivermos, fico com capital para abrir outras trades. Ninguém morre. Acho que é isso. Acho que se calhar é melhor, lá está, ter isso, mano, garantir alguns lucros. Porque é como se costuma dizer, nunca ninguém ficou pobre por tirar lucros. Fica-se pobre sim, é por não tirar lucros. Deixar sempre as cenas descerem, certo? Falo por experiência própria também, de outras vezes. Muitas vezes não tirei lucros e depois a posição fechou. E é o que é. Acho que vai ser isso, mano. Mano, agora estamos a ver aqui Bitcoin a subir outra vez. Por isso, acho que está fixe. Agora, para quem está aí a ver a live, vamos passar para a Twitch, porque para celebrar vamos fazer um bónus hunt no casino de 500 euros. Se vocês também quiserem jogar, podem ir ao meu Linktree, que está, por acaso não está aqui nesta live, mas qualquer outro vídeo que têm aí no meu canal, têm aí o meu Linktree, têm lá o link para a Twitch, se quiserem passar também para lá, e têm o link também para o Lebull, que é para onde vamos agora jogar. Tem 100% de bónus no primeiro depósito, mais uma free bet uma free bet de 10 euros, 50% no segundo depósito, mais uma free bet de 20 e 100% no terceiro, mais uma free bet de 20 também. Só para maiores de 18 e joguem com responsabilidade. Mas é isso, vamos passar então para a Twitch. Daqui a 5 minutos vemos lá na Twitch, vão já para lá, eu já vou abrir lá a live e até já. Vamos também lá continuar a ver aqui o preço de cripto em direto, só para estar atento a tudo. E é isso, pessoal, obrigado por terem visto aí a live. Deixem aí o vosso like, não se esqueçam, e partilhem a live com alguém que vocês conheçam que esteja aí em cripto. E até já.